Hello, thank you for joining us. I'm Kan Young-woo from the Korea Herald. Here are the top stories of the week. South Korea has decided to extend its level 2.5 social distancing measures until next weekend in efforts to stop the further spread of the novel coronavirus. The government implemented the stronger quarantine guidelines on August 30th, with the number of new cases continuously reaching over 200 each day. Here are some of the major changes under the government's strengthened guidelines, which will be effective through the weekend. Only takeout orders are allowed at coffee chains. Dining it at restaurants is prohibited after 9 p.m. Private tutoring services cannot have classes larger than 10 people. Indoor sports facilities like gym, pool clubs, and bowling alleys cannot operate at all. Japan's longest-serving Prime Minister Shinzo Abe announced his resignation last Friday, citing a chronic health problem. He said it was gut-wrenching to leave the job before accomplishing his goals, mentioning the failure to resolve the issue of Japanese abducted years ago by North Korea and a territorial dispute with Russia. Abe has had ulcerative colitis since he was a teenager. He said his health problem was under control until earlier this year, but was found to have relapsed in June when he had an annual checkup. Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party will hold a presidential election on September 14th to choose Abe's successor. Thousands of junior doctors ended their 2-week-long strike on Friday, which was in protest against the government's medical reform scheme. This came after a group of representative doctors reached an agreement with the government and the ruling Democratic Party. The two sides reached a 5-point agreement that includes putting on hold the government's plan to increase medical school admission quotas until after the novel coronavirus outbreak eases. They also decided to set up a joint council for more talks between the medical sector and the health authorities over a variety of issues ranging from setup of a public medical school to health insurance coverage. Under the agreement, the fellow doctors and residents as well as interns at general hospitals across the country have now returned to their work. We'll talk more about this in a second. The doctor's strike has ended, but issues are still left to solve. We're joined by our reporter Kim Hye-yeon. Thanks for coming in.
Good to be back.
So, what had been the issue here so far, and what are the different sides saying?
Okay, so the Korean government had been in struggle with another huge burden for the past 2 months, while it is still fighting COVID-19, the issue of doctors going on strike. On July 23rd, the government laid out a medical reform plan that would increase the number of medical students by 4,000 over 10 years starting in 2022, and would also involve establishing a new public medical school as part of efforts to expand access to healthcare services. But this drew strong opposition from doctors who argue that the country already has enough doctors. The doctors said that the government's medical reform plan is not the answer to the challenges facing the medical sector. They say what's needed first and foremost is more investment in rural hospitals. They're also calling for an overhaul of the country's medical insurance system.
I see. What reforms were the government planning for the medical sector and why?
Okay, so first, let's take a look at the brief history of government's reform plan, which had come out on July 23rd. The government's original plan was to increase quotas for medical students to reverse a past policy decision in the early 2000s. At that time, the government reduced medical school quotas in a compromise with the Korean Medical Association, which was adamantly opposed to the separation of a doctor's role, that of prescribing medicine, from that of a pharmacist dispensing it. The KMA had eventually agreed to allow pharmacists to dispense medicine, but in return, they wanted Korea to have fewer doctors.
Why the increase in doctors? And are we running out of doctors at this point in South Korea?
The problem that the government was trying to solve at that time was inequality of medical care and treatments throughout the nation. The plan here was to train 300 doctors who would be in charge of providing essential medical care in vulnerable regions throughout the country. In addition, there were separate quotas to hire those willing to work in specialized training fields, such as epidemiologists and pediatric surgery, as well as future researchers who will be continuing their studies in the field of basic science and biomedicine. In other words, the big plan here is to establish a public medical school that would admit 49 students every year. This meant to foster doctors willing to work in public healthcare. The government had also addressed the issue of medical students choosing to pass over certain specialties that are less appealing to them, those such as internal medicine or general and thoracic surgery. 3,000 medical students would be choosing majors designated by the Ministry of Health and Welfare, in other words, to specialize in fields where there is greater need for doctors.
So for those viewers who are not following this issue, what happened right before the agreement was made today?
The doctors had been on a second full-swing strike since 21st, and just last week on Saturday, South Korea's health authorities issued back-to-work orders to 278 striking doctors, warning of possible prison terms. In addition, the government had repeatedly stressed that it is open to discussing the matter once the COVID-19 crisis is over. Prime Minister Chung Se-kyun said during the Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasures headquarters meetings that the government had no choice but to react in line with the law and principles to protect the lives and security of its people. Chung had urged the doctors to call off their strike, saying there is not much time left in this COVID-19 crisis.
I see. But what do you think is the debate behind the surface, the real talk?
To begin with, a survey showed Tuesday that more than half of South Koreans supported the government's plan to increase the number of doctors, while 9 out of 10 doctors opposed to it. Here's a symbolic post worth taking a look at. The Research Institute for Healthcare Policy under the KMA posted a quiz to its Facebook page September 1st. The heading was, "Facts that the government and the media aren't telling you. Only those who oppose the doctor strike should take this quiz." The Research Institute deleted the post right after getting complaints about it, but it's still spreading on social media. Let's take a look at one of the quiz questions. If you could choose a doctor, who would you choose? A doctor who studied hard, always getting the top grade point average in medical school, or B, a doctor whose grade point average falls far short, but who graduated from a public medical school on a recommendation basis and who succeeded in becoming a doctor regardless. The comments posted in response to the quiz included, "Do doctors really think a high GPA is the cure to treating patients?" Another one posted, "If doctors really think this way, why don't we quickly switch to AI robot doctors instead? They must have better GPAs after all." Now, we do understand the attention. The Institute was trying to criticize the government's push to strengthen public healthcare. We get the point. But we hope that starting now, as we reach to further agreements, the voices raised by doctors will not spread even more doubt and worries among the public, who rely on doctors during hard times. I'm sure there will be thousands of patients today who have been waiting desperately for doctors, those who will be more than glad to see them come back on duty.
That's right, Haeyeon. We sure hope both sides, the government and the medical sector, can work things out through dialogue. Again, thank you for your report.
Thank you, Khan.
That does it for us today. Until next time, goodbye.